Well, hello. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to talk about changing legal status. This is Mark Emery. I'm the founder of the Lighthouse Law Club. Most of you know who I am. Those of you who don't, stick around. You'll catch up quick enough, I'm sure. This is a members-only webinar, and we'll be sharing part of it with the public. And we're going to be getting into, again, changing legal status. You know, the one thing that I really enjoy the most about the Law Club is having the opportunity to speak personally and directly with each and every one of you, as you come along. And there are so many fascinating stories, so many fascinating personalities. I just find it a real joy to share the energy that we create in putting some great minds together. And in that regard, there seems to be a common theme with most everybody that I talk to. And that common theme is that we recognize the mess that we're in by virtue of how we've been suckered into contracts without full disclosure and lack of informed consent. And we've been suckered into this legal status that we need to get out of, and we need to change it to get back to our natural, God-given, inherent state of presence so that we don't have all of these interferences and intrusions and compelled performance statutes intruding and imposing themselves in our lives. So that's a common theme, and so let's get into it. Now, there's a lot of folks out there doing different things. That's really great. As one individual, you can only do so many things, same with myself or anybody else. And the fact that we're all having different experiences is something that we can draw on and gain strength from. Now, where I'm headed with this is real simple. As it relates to changing status, there are some very advanced legal technologies out there that get into some very exotic types of paperwork and processes. Becoming the secured creditor on the bond created by your birth certificate. That's a fascinating process. I'm fascinated by it. I haven't done it myself yet. And I think it could very well be very effective under the right circumstances. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Tonight we're going to stick to practical measures for moving to the private side and living a private life. These are practical things that you and I can do in short order without getting wrapped up in all kinds of fancy legal documents and legal mumbo-jumbo and extended processes and interactions and waiting for responses and all of that kind of thing. Again, as valuable as that may be, but as we go along here today, you'll find out why it's important that we do much more than that, and if we don't take care of the practical matters first, then all your fancy legal paperwork isn't going to mean diddly squat. All right, you're going to see that. So let's take a few minutes, just review some of the basics. Most of you, I'm sure, have the basics under your belt, but it's important that we establish this review so we have a solid foundation to proceed on, and that those who are just coming along, just getting on board with some of this type of information and training, that they can come along with us and catch up with us real quick so that we're all on the same page when we get to the finish line. Okay? So let's jump right into it. Let's compare the private side with the public side. We can see that in the beginning, God created man. We'll call him John Michael Smith. And everyone else, right? That's where it all started. He gave us dominion over the earth, and he blessed us abundantly. Based on what? Our covenant with him. He later gave a covenant to Moses. What's another word for a covenant? It's a contract. Our blessings were premised upon the fulfillment of our end of that covenant. If we failed in the contract, guess what? The blessings would be withdrawn, and we'd have our own devices to deal with. and the results that come from that. And here we are. All right, so contract law you will find throughout the Bible. And this is where it all comes from. With that, we have natural rights. Rights are not something that anybody can give you, but rights are something that nobody can take away. Those rights include the right to free travel. If we have dominion over the earth, we come and go as we please. We ingress and egress. We don't need to pay someone for permission to travel. We have the right to be left alone, to live our own life however we want to live it, believe whatever we want to believe, be as weird as we want to be. And so long as we don't impose or trespass upon the rights or property of someone else, there is no crime, there's peace, and we live our lives as we see fit. We have the right to self-defense, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. If you understand history, when our founding fathers were writing the Declaration of Independence, there was a great debate over what word should be used. Should it be property or happiness? Initially, the phrase was the pursuit of life, liberty, and property, because one who has the right to own, claim, and use property is happy. And so that embodies happiness. And so there was a great debate that, one means the same as the other. So we can use that term property interchangeably. So we have the right to pursuit of life, liberty, and property, or we can say we have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. So man created state government to regulate his affairs and to serve him, so that we'd have halls of justice, we could have some order, we'd have some agreed upon rules that we could all live by, so that we could all live with increased security and more prosperity, so we could do business and live. So state government was created to serve man. So as the states sprouted up in the history of the United States of America, there were 13 colonies who evolved into states. Those states started having different currencies, different rules, and the conflicts increased as each state kind of went about its own business in a little different way. And so with that conflict, that level of conflict growing, it was imperative that the state governments get together and create a federal government to help unify standards and protocols and to better manage the intercourse between the different states. So things would run a little bit, or if not a lot, more smoothly. From this point, administrative agencies were then created to help both the federal and the state governments administer their affairs, just helping take care of the administration of the business that was intended. So here we see the hierarchy. Look at who's on top, where this all started. This is the hierarchy of order. Everything starts with God. God created man, gave him dominion over the earth. Man serves God, and man is the top man on the totem pole in the physical world here on the earth. State governments serve man, federal governments serve the state governments, and the agencies work for everybody else. And this is the hierarchy of order. This is the private side. This is the private side where man is the sovereign, under God, of course. So long as we maintain our covenant with God, we maintain those blessings, we maintain our dominion over the earth, we are blessed abundantly in everything that we do, and things proceed along the lines of a life of freedom, liberty, life, liberty, and property, right? So let's look at the public side. On the public side, the government creates John M. Smith. This is not the John M. Smith that was born and created by God. This is a different John M. Smith. This is a fictional entity, just like a corporation is a fiction. John M. Smith, all capital letters, is a corporate entity. It's a fiction. All right, so now that this is created, the federal government has dominion over the state governments due to the money powers and many other things. It also has dominion over John M. Smith. Those federal administrative agencies also have dominion over John M. Smith. And John Michael Smith doesn't know any better, so he identifies himself as John M. Smith, responds to the mail, and acts as though he is one and the same, and all of a sudden he no longer has dominion over the earth. In fact, not only does he not have dominion over the earth, he doesn't even have dominion over himself, or his house, or his land, or his kids. The government owns him and is telling him what to do, what to buy, what kind of insurance to have, how much to have, what kind of cars to buy, where to put his kids, how he should buy his house, what kind of standards his house needs to live up to. He doesn't have dominion over his land. Look at what the BLM is doing to the ranchers, kicking them off their land, stealing it, burning down their houses. We don't own land. And you certainly don't have dominion over your kids when Child Protective Services knocks on your door and takes them away just because they can. So the question comes down real simple. What side of the law would you like to be on? It's pretty obvious why so many people are catching on and wanting to move over to the private side, right? It comes down to a hierarchy of order. Do we want to live in a land where federal and state governments have dominion over us? We don't have any God-given rights? Or do we want to live where man is sovereign, in covenant with and under God, where we have the freedom to live our lives as we see fit? And we have the governments to serve us and to maintain stability and security and nothing more. So the choice is quite obvious, right? So that's why we're moving from the public to the private and changing our legal status. How do we get suckered into all this? I know most of you are aware of this, but let's just review it real quickly. All right, the birth certificate for John M. Smith is created. When he is born, he is taken from the water. When the water breaks from his mother, he is delivered upon the land. The baby is delivered from the water, admiralty, delivered upon the land. A certificate is created, as in a bill of lading from the ship's manifest. The ship is the vessel, which was the mother. Again, bringing admiralty from the water upon the land. The certificate indicates that there is ownership over John M. Smith, but it is not the title. It merely is evidence of the existence of a title for John M. Smith. So that's where things start. Social Security, we're told we need to apply for a Social Security card in order to get a job. We all know the story behind that. It's a big lie. The law itself says it's purely voluntary. In fact, there was a lawsuit with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission when someone objected to being forced to put a Social Security number on their job application with Taco Bell in order to get a job. And they won that lawsuit. They were not required to put their Social Security number to get a job. But the point here is that the application, when you sign that as true, complete, and correct, and put your authenticated signature upon that application for contract, that application is full of admissions and confessions, just like all federal documents are. You admit to being a United States citizen. Well, at that point in your life, when you're a 15-year-old kid, chances are you were a state citizen and not a federal citizen. So, there's all kinds of ramifications on that. We understand that. All kinds of admissions and confessions that are not true. It's fraudulent inducement, lack of informed consent. You didn't know what you were signing. Okay? It's based on fraud, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Federal Reserve notes are promises to pay. That's what a note is. promissory note. So our currency that we're exchanging every day are promises to pay which never get paid. In fact, since the United States became bankrupt in 1933, there has been no lawful payment done since that time. We've been exchanging credit and negotiable instruments. And since nothing is paid by law, because there is no lawful money in circulation, what we're doing is we're exercising the franchise, which is the privilege of discharging debt. The privilege of discharging debt is not lawful, but it is public policy. So we're not operating in law, we're operating in public policy. And the public policy is, since you never paid for anything, you don't own anything, which is why the government can come and take anything from you whenever they want, because you don't own it. So we won't get into that, the whole money issue. That's something that needs to be understood very well, if you don't already, and many of you do. Corporate employment is a key element. One of the first things the judge will ask you when you step into court, okay, and are you employed? Where are you employed? Oh, well, I'm a warehouse manager over at Home Depot over on Lincoln Avenue. Okay, very good. And where do you reside? Oh, I'm over here on 910 Birch Street. Okay, so the judge says, so you reside and you're doing business in the state. Thank you very much. You've just granted me jurisdiction. We will now proceed against you. Corporate employment is very problematic. We'll talk about that as we get into some of the details, but you need to be seriously thinking about doing something about that. And again, we'll get into that in just a minute. But those are federal benefits. Corporations are creatures of the state. When you work for a creature of the state, exchanging your services for promises to pay, which are issued by the Federal Reserve, a private corporation, you are so deep into commercial law and federal regulation, it isn't funny. All right, so that's something we need to be careful of. Being a resident. All right, let's break this word apart. I get into this in my workshop, The Private Traveler. Res is the Latin term for the thing. Ident is the root for identified, right? So resident is the thing identified. Identified as what? Identified as property, inventory, chattel. You understand? Because you're identifying yourself with John M. Smith in all capital letters, you are owned by the state. So again, that's why the judge asks you right off the bat, where do you work and where do you reside? All right, you better have a good answer for that. Do you have a bank account? Well, you ask, well, how could having a bank account set me up for receiving federal benefits? If you've got a bank account in your name, your signature is on the account, you've accepted all the terms of the bank, and even though the bank may have a state charter, it's a state chartered bank, it does have FDIC insurance. And so you're receiving benefits from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So there's your federal benefits right there. Insurance contracts. The state requires John M. Smith to have various insurance contracts. He needs to have automobile insurance, he needs to have health insurance, he needs to have business insurance, liability insurance, right on down the line. Insurance contracts are interstate compacts. They're interstate agreements. They derive from maritime jurisdiction. This brings us right into commerce, which brings us right into federal regulation. And that's a whole subject we could get into, but we won't. Okay, you know about the driver's license and the marriage license. What is a license? A license is permission to do that which is otherwise illegal. So that begs the question, well, geez, when was it ever illegal for me to drive my grandma to the church? Well, just by virtue of the fact that you do not understand language, we can see that by virtue of the fact that you're using the term driver, that you are a driver. You're applying to be a driver, and therefore you want to get licensed. Driver is a commercial term. We have taxi drivers. We have truck drivers. We have private chauffeurs who are drivers. We have postal carriers who are drivers. We have package delivery people that are drivers. This is all commerce in transport. These are commercial terms. Now, if you're not engaged in commerce on the roadways and the byways, then you are not a driver. Therefore, why on earth would you apply for a driver's license? You've always had the right to travel, and people are learning this, and they're learning how to do it successfully. So, again, you were fraudulently induced. Nobody told you about that, so you applied for commercial privileges. When did it become illegal to get married? The marriage license actually originated, I believe it was back in the 1800s, when they made it illegal for interracial marriages to happen. All right? They didn't want the slaves marrying the non-slave class. And so the license was required. And then the practice grew, and all of a sudden, what you're doing now is you're taking a right and converting it to a privilege granted by the state. When I got married, I didn't use a marriage license. I found a pastor who would do it without one. Not all of them will. So what happens when you apply for a marriage license? You're bringing the state into the marriage as a third party, just like your spouse is. So the state has equal standing as your spouse does in that marriage. I was talking to a gentleman from Montana, and he looked at the back of his marriage license, and it stated very clearly that the product of this marriage belongs to the state. Well, think about that. What's the product of a marriage? Children. Are you starting to get the picture now? These are very serious issues. So these are some of the benefits that we apply for, and we get sucked into these contracts. In doing that, really we violate the covenant that we had with God. And so we move from that jurisdiction, we get sucked into another jurisdiction, which is highly regulated and generates fees, fines, all kinds of forms, and we could go on and on. All right, so this is what traps us. Let's take a look at this. The private Federal Reserve Bank. Look on your dollar, your Federal Reserve notes. You see that E on the left. That E signifies the issuing bank, the bank that issued this Federal Reserve note. And E happens to stand for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so when we see that E, we know which bank owns this promissory note. And if they ever decide to claim it, it's theirs, they can come and get it. Okay? So you see that same E in the serial number, which again immediately identifies the issuer. The issuer is the owner. Now, we can see also on the back of the Social Security card, this number is not the Social Security number. There are many people out there that know more about this than I do, but they'll tell you that this is the registration number or the bond number representing the bond that's created by virtue of your application for the Social Security card. Now, how could they create a bond? Well, when you apply for the Social Security number, what are you doing? You're saying, I want you to take so much money out of my check for the rest of my life on the hopes that maybe I'll see some of it back when I retire. Think of all the money that someone generates, not only in terms of withholdings, but taxes paid, all the different types of taxes that are paid. I saw a list of all the taxes that are paid, and it was pages. I mean, there were hundreds of different types of taxes that we pay. And so think about how that adds up over someone's lifetime and as a part of their earnings. And when that compounds, and when you can use leverage with the fractional reserve banking system, how you can take $1, make it $10, lend that out again, and do it over and over and over. It becomes exponential. So we can see that this account is owned by the Federal Reserve Bank. This account is in the name of John M. Smith, and you identify yourself as John M. Smith, and therefore you're obligated to this account to continue paying for the rest of your life. So isn't that sweet? Okay? Just something to be aware of. So, the IRS is a private collection branch for the Federal Reserve. That's what they do. They collect for the private Federal Reserve. Now, take a look at this. The IRS doesn't collect money for the government. They're a private trust domiciled in Puerto Rico. And you can look it up yourself. Let's read this. In 1953, the Internal Revenue was created by the stroke of a pen when the Secretary of the Treasury changed the name of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, Treasury Order number 150-29, G.M. Humphrey, Secretary of the Treasury, July 9, 1953. However, no congressional or presidential authorization for making this change has been located. So, the source of the authority had to originate elsewhere. Research to which IRS officials have acquiesced suggests that the Secretary exercised his authority as trustee of Puerto Rico Trust number 62, Internal Revenue. And you can see this in Title 31 of the U.S. Code, Section 1321. Look it up yourself. And as will be demonstrated, the Secretary does, in fact, operate as Secretary of the Treasury, Puerto Rico, which is a territory. It's not even a state. Puerto Rico, as a territory, is managed by the United States in Washington, D.C., the corporation. United States, the corporation. Now, one thing you may not be aware of is that the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States does not receive his paycheck from the United States federal government. He is paid by whom, do you know? By the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So, what's this telling us? The treasurer of the United States is paid by foreign interests. The people you pay your so-called taxes to in the IRS, that money actually, well, number one, doesn't even touch the floor of U.S. government offices. So if you think you're paying for roads and bridges and schools and health centers and justice systems and armies and military and everything else with your taxes, I'm sorry to tell you, not one penny is going to anything that benefits the people. It's going straight into a private trust, which is managed by a combination of the IMF, a federal corporation known as the Federal Reserve Bank, and that ultimately ends up with the Queen of England or the Vatican. So, you want to pay your taxes? That's your choice. It's entirely your choice. All right? So, you say to yourself, well, crap. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to pay my taxes if that's where it's going. Well, I'm sorry, but you're hooked. You're hooked by the agreements that you've made. You've made admissions and confessions in the applications that you've signed that you are a charter member of this corporation known as the United States. Nothing to do with the government. And you're regulated by commerce. You're engaged in commerce. You're wrapped up by contracts. And unless you do something about that, you're stuck. You're hooked. You're not getting off the hook. We've got agreements in place. So this is the dilemma that we find ourselves in, right? Let me give you some resources right now. Having said that, it's very easy to rid yourself of the IRS. It's very simple. I should say it's simple, not always so easy, but it is simple where you can do it safely and securely and not go into any level of risk. And I show you how. We start number one. You need to get, if you haven't already, get this free download. I wrote a book called How I Beat Satan and the IRS. You can get it free. Go to the onefreemanswar.com. Go to the Defend America page. And all I ask in exchange for this free book that I'm giving you, I want you to share it with at least 2 other people. And get their commitment that they will share it with 2 other people. If we can get this to go viral, we can expose the fraud in the country. We'll know what's going on. So, get your free download there. Then once you've gone through this, it's a short read, it's a quick read. It's only about 62 pages and a lot of white space, a lot of quotes. There's about 10, 11, 12 chapters in there. Each chapter deals with a different element of the IRS fraud. Makes it very easy to see. It's not hard to read at all. It's not full of a lot of legalese. Should be quite entertaining and informative. But participate in the Defend America program. Get the word out. Share this link with people you know. And then once you want to do something about it, we have an IRS Freedom Package that provides supporting documents and the processes to put a couple of these most important strategies to work where you can safely and securely simply walk away. Okay? It's pretty simple. Now, I would also recommend a video workshop that I've done that will get into some more detail and lay some things out. And it shows the only 2 roads that the IRS travels on. And if you can block those 2 roads, there's nothing they can do. What you do is you make yourself immune. And it's real simple to make yourself immune. And if they can't throw you in jail, and if they can't take your stuff, your bank accounts, your house, your property, position yourself so they can't do that. If they can't touch your stuff, and if they can't throw you in jail, there's nothing they can do. They can holler and scream all they want. Okay? But the previous taxpayer is going to show you how to do that. So that's video on demand, and that's, I don't know, about 90 minutes, maybe a couple hours maximum. And you'll find it there at that link. So those are a couple resources right off the bat that you have that I'd be happy to share with you. All right, so we got to get the IRS out of our lives, and you need to understand that fraud vitiates all contracts. And that's coming straight from the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a maxim of law that goes back before the country was ever created. It goes back many, many, many generations. You know, the Supreme Court said in Throckmorton versus the U.S., the maxim that fraud vitiates every proceeding must be taken. In other words, they could not ignore the fact in this case that the entire case of the defendant was based on fraud to start with, which means that everything that proceeded from that was null and void. You know, it's fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. If the tree is poison, the fruit is poison. And you can't go beyond that. So it starts with contracts. So we go back to all those contracts that you signed with the Social Security application and those type of things. And there's a process for basically putting the people, the counterparties to those contracts on notice that you have uncovered their fraud, you know what it is, you are stating the fraud, you are putting them on notice that you are no longer participating in the fraud, and that you consider that original contract null and void, nunc pro tunc. Okay, now for then, as from the beginning. So that's a fundamental issue. And so we have to get into understanding a very simple concept. A lot of people are rushing around doing paperwork, and then they're hauled into court, and the judge asks those key questions. Where do you reside, and where do you work? And people are flashing around these fancy documents. Oh, but I got this, and I'm sovereign, and those laws don't apply to me, and I don't consent, and all this stuff. And the judge just, takes silent judicial notice of certain things relating to substance that can be obviously seen, and you have neglected to cover those because you're more concerned about your documents, which are the form. All right, this doctrine, substance over form, really comes originally from the bookkeeping and the accounting world, where people may structure certain transactions in a way to minimize or avoid entirely taxation. And there's nothing wrong with that, provided that their activities are substantive and real, and the relationships involved in those transactions are real relationships, real people or entities doing real business. So you've got to have the substance, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about practical issues on how to create substance so that you don't stumble over your own form, your documents, your filings, and end up nullifying all of that because the substance just isn't there. Case law from this doctrine has stated that in order for the mortar to work, there must actually be bricks. So the bricks are the substance, okay? The mortar is the form. You got to have real bricks going on here. All right, so what I'm saying is that your behavior, the way you live, the things you do must match the assertions that you're making. You can't just say, oh, I'm a private individual, I'm not engaged in commerce, look at my documents. Okay, when the judge can see right off the bat with a couple simple questions that you are still engaged in commerce, you're still receiving federal benefits, and you're just as much a slave as you ever were. Because the documents don't do anything if the substance isn't there. And so that's what we're going to get into right now. We're going to get into some of those details and figure out how we can be practical and move to the private side, perhaps without even needing all these fancy and exotic documents and processes. Okay? I'm just a practical guy. I like to go with what works, and this is what's worked for me time and time again. Okay? Now, the details that we're going to cover, I've listed at the end of my private traveler workshop. And the private traveler really establishes the fundamental legal elements that are necessary to understand when moving from the public side to the private side. Okay? So this establishes a very good foundation. It's an on-demand video workshop that's available at this link. At the end of this presentation, I go into a list of these practical items. I cover the list, but I don't really get into the details. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to get into those details and dig into what it takes actually to have some of these practical issues resolved in your favor so that you've got the substance. Once you have the substance and are living on the private side, then is a good time to go and pursue the documentation, the legal processes, the liens, the trademarks, the copyrights, whatever it is you want to do. Okay? So from this point, we proceeded in the web conference complete version that our members were a part of for the members web conference. We proceeded to review a list of about 20 different practical items. We covered each one in detail. These are things you can do to separate yourself from the behavior of federal citizens. These are practical issues that increase your privacy, that will change your visibility and status as a resident. And it's quite fascinating that as you begin to implement these points, you eliminate the accoutrements of federal subject citizens. This is extremely important because whenever you find yourself in front of a judge, for example, or dealing with officialdom, they are trained to take silent judicial notice of certain facts, certain elements, things you say, your behavior, things that appear in your paperwork. These are all the elements that we need to work to eliminate, if in fact you really do want to change your status back to the private side. In the complete web conference that our members were involved in, we went over these in quite some detail and at length in a step-by-step process. This video is for public purposes and is not the complete video that our members have access to. So, that being the case, once these things are accomplished, you cannot be mistaken as a resident doing business in the state, which are the first two elements that any court or judge will try to establish in order to get jurisdiction over you as a fictional entity subject to federal status. Okay? These are all very interesting, very fascinating things, simple things that can be done, and quite interesting from the standpoint that once you can accomplish these things, everything changes, and you're in a much more private and secure position. So, that being said, I would steer your attention to the website for the Lighthouse Law Club, and that's at lighthouselaw.club. In particular, I will steer your attention to the blog page. You'll find the blog link in the menu at the top of the page. And in the blog, we've got several videos, but I want to steer your attention to one in particular, and that is the vision of the Law Club, which will give you a good idea. It's about a 1-hour web conference that we had, and that'll give you an excellent idea as to really what the Law Club is all about and how you could participate and benefit from the activities of other members. The whole idea is to create synergy with all the activities that everybody is doing in different parts of the country, following different strategies, different activities in different disciplines. So browse the site, have a look around. We welcome you to join us in the Law Club. It's pretty painless, and we can do some great things together. So with that, I give you my best wishes. May God bless, and I hope to see you in the club with us soon. Thanks and take care.